You people are all the same. Officer Sterling ripped the man's insurance paper into pieces and let it scatter in the freezing wind. Not a warning, not a question. A verdict delivered at 4 a.m. on a dark, wet street in front of a neighborhood too afraid to breathe. The man in the rusted sedan didn't shout, didn't argue, didn't move. Both hands stayed perfectly still on the cracked steering wheel. But what Sterling didn't know about the man he was threatening with a fake arrest.
Unbelievable. He just destroyed a federal subpoena with his own hands and has no idea. Keep watching.
The street was dead. Absolutely dead. Not a single soul moved through the dark suburban corridor at 4 a.m, and the silence pressed down like something physical, something cold, something that had weight and texture and teeth. Marcus Hayes drove slowly. He kept both hands on the wheel. He kept his speed exactly at the posted limit, not a single mile over, not a single mile under, because he knew this neighborhood and he knew what this neighborhood did to men who looked like him. The cracked leather of the steering wheel was soft under his palms, old, worn down by years of use. The kind of wear that told a story about a man who drove long hours and asked nothing of anyone. The dashboard lights glowed a faint amber, casting weak shadows across his face, across his faded college sweatshirt, across the quiet, unreadable expression he had been rehearsing for 3 hours. He had chosen this car carefully. He had chosen this route carefully. He had chosen everything carefully because careful men survive, and Marcus Hayes had survived a great deal. He noticed the cruiser 2 blocks back, just a shape at first. Just 2 headlights sitting idle in a parking lot off Renner Avenue, pointed outward waiting. He did not accelerate. He did not slow down. He kept his foot exactly where it was and let the sedan roll forward at its steady, patient pace, because any change in speed would give the man in that parking lot exactly the excuse he was looking for. Marcus watched the headlights in his rearview mirror. He counted his breaths. 1, 2, 3. The headlights moved. The cruiser pulled out of the lot without its lights on, sliding into the street behind him, with the slow, deliberate ease of something that had done this many times before and had never once been stopped. 4 seconds passed. 5. 6. Marcus kept his hands still. The cruiser closed the gap. Then the spotlight hit, and the whole world turned white. It was not a normal light. It was the kind of light that does not illuminate but interrogates. It poured through every window of the sedan, filling the interior with a harsh, flat glare that left no shadows, no corners, no privacy. It struck the cracked leather of the steering wheel and made it look brittle and cheap. It struck Marcus's hands and made them look very dark against the pale, washed-out dashboard. He did not flinch. He did not raise his hand to shield his eyes. He simply kept both palms open flat, visible resting at 10 and 2, because that was what the moment required, and Marcus Hayes always gave the moment exactly what it required. The siren hit next. 1 short burst. Sharp, deafening, absolute. It tore through the dead quiet of the street like something being ripped in half, and the sound bounced off the narrow faces of the houses on either side, and came back doubled, tripled, filling the cold air with its own echo. Marcus pulled to the curb. He did it smoothly, without hesitation, without drama, guiding the old sedan to a stop with the same quiet precision he applied to everything. He put it in park. He killed the engine. He placed both hands back on the wheel and waited. Behind him, the cruiser door did not open immediately. This was intentional. This was a technique. Let the man in the car sit with the spotlight burning into his mirrors. Let the silence stretch. Let the uncertainty work on him. Let him wonder what was coming. Marcus had read about this technique in 11 separate civil rights complaints filed against this specific precinct over the past 14 months. He had read about it in depositions and incident reports, in the handwritten statements of frightened people who had pulled to the curb on streets exactly like this one, and sat exactly where he was sitting now, and who had not had what he had tucked into his inner pocket. A tiny red light pulsed on the dash cam mounted behind the rearview mirror. Steady, quiet, patient. It blinked once every 2 seconds, a small, almost invisible heartbeat in the dark interior of the car. Marcus did not look at it. He already knew it was working. He had confirmed it 3 times before he left the office because Marcus Hayes did not leave things to chance, and the dash cam was not a precaution. It was the foundation of everything. The cruiser door opened. Boots hit the pavement heavy and deliberate, each step slow, each step measured, designed to communicate ownership of the space, ownership of the moment, ownership of everything within the radius of that spotlight. Marcus watched the shape approach in his side mirror. Broad shoulders, badge catching the amber glow of a distant street lamp. One hand resting near the belt, not on anything, not reaching for anything, just resting, just reminding. The figure stopped at the rear of the sedan and stood there for a full 4 seconds before moving again. Sterling reached the window. He did not tap the glass. He stood beside the door and waited, making Marcus the one to roll it down, making Marcus initiate the contact, making Marcus come to him. Marcus rolled the window down. The cold air came in immediately, sharp and wet, carrying the smell of rain on asphalt and the faint chemical bite of exhaust from the cruiser still idling behind them. Sterling looked down at him. The smirk was already there. It had probably been there since the parking lot. "License and registration," he said. Not a question, not a greeting, not even the pretense of a greeting. Marcus reached slowly, carefully, deliberately for the glove compartment. He moved the way a man moves when he knows every movement is being watched and judged, slow and open and unhurried, because hurried hands gave men like Sterling reasons. And Marcus was not in the business of giving Sterling reasons tonight. He was in the business of taking them away. Sterling thought he had pulled over an easy target. He was about to find out he had just pulled over a nightmare. 3 hours earlier, the DOJ building was silent. Not the silence of a street at 4 a.m, not the heavy, wet silence of a neighborhood holding its breath, but the clean, climate-controlled silence of a federal building after midnight, the kind of silence that hums faintly with fluorescent light and recycled air, and the quiet, persistent weight of unfinished work. Marcus sat at his desk. He did not slouch. He did not lean back. He sat forward, both forearms flat on the surface, his eyes moving across the stack of complaints in front of him with the slow, methodical patience of a man who had trained himself never to skim, never to summarize, never to let the sheer volume of suffering reduce itself to a number. The complaints were organized by date. 14 months, 41 separate incidents, 41 people who had been pulled over, searched, threatened, humiliated, or falsely cited on the streets of one precinct in one district by a pattern of officers that Internal Affairs had reviewed twice and cleared both times. Marcus had read every page. He had read the handwritten ones, the ones where the pen pressed harder toward the end of the statement, where the handwriting changed shape under the pressure of remembering. He had read the typed ones, the ones filtered through lawyers and formal language, where the anger had been translated into procedure and the fear had been translated into dates and badge numbers. He had read them all and he had felt every single one. And then he had set the feeling aside, because feeling was not the tool he needed tonight. Tonight, he needed precision. He stood. He crossed the office to the evidence locker on the far wall. The locker was standard issue gray metal, unremarkable. He opened it with a key from his jacket pocket and stood for a moment looking at the row of impounded items inside. Keys, documents, personal effects. And at the far left, a single set of car keys on a plain metal ring tagged with a case number and a make and model. A 2008 sedan, impounded from an unrelated civil forfeiture case 6 weeks ago, rusted at the wheel wells, one functioning window, bald front tires that were legal by exactly 2 millimeters. It was by every visible measure the kind of car that made a certain kind of police officer feel confident, feel certain, feel like the stop would be easy. Marcus took the keys. He went back to his desk and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, resting on a folded cloth, was his badge. Heavy gleaming gold, the seal of the Department of Justice, pressed into the metal with the clean, permanent authority of something that could not be argued with, could not be disputed, could not be torn in half, and dropped in the mud. He lifted it with both hands. He looked at it for a moment, not with pride, not with ceremony, but with the same focused assessment he gave everything. Then he folded it into the inner pocket of his sweatshirt, the old frayed college sweatshirt he had brought specifically for tonight, and pressed the pocket flat against his chest. The sweatshirt was 10 years old. It had a small bleach stain on the left sleeve and a fraying hem and a faded university logo that had lost 2 of its original 4 colors. It was the kind of garment that communicated a very specific thing to a very specific kind of person, and Marcus had chosen it with the same deliberate care he applied to every other element of the night. He sat back down. He pulled a single sheet of paper from the secure printer beside his desk, checked it once, checked it twice, then folded it in thirds. It was a federal subpoena. Specifically, it was a subpoena for the complete personnel and disciplinary records of Sterling's precinct, including all use of force reports, all internal affairs files, and all supervisory communications relating to traffic stop conduct over the past 18 months. It was active. It was signed. It bore the seal of a federal district court judge who had reviewed the 41 complaints and agreed in writing that a pattern existed. Marcus slid the subpoena into a plain plastic insurance sleeve, the cheap kind that gas stations sell for $2, the kind that sat in every glove compartment in America without attracting a second look. He placed the sleeve on the passenger seat of the impounded sedan. He clipped the dash cam to the rearview mirror himself. He ran the cable along the headliner, tucked it behind the sun visor, and connected it to the dedicated federal satellite uplink transmitter mounted behind the dashboard. The connection tone was a single, sharp, metallic click, clean and definitive. He watched the indicator light come on. Red, steady, transmitting. Everything the dash cam recorded would upload in real time to a secure federal server, time-stamped and encrypted, admissible in any federal court in the country. Impossible to delete, impossible to dispute, impossible to lose. Even if someone took the camera, even if someone destroyed it, the footage was already gone, already safe, already somewhere untouchable. Marcus sat in the driver's seat of the rusted sedan for a moment before starting the engine. The interior smelled of old upholstery and someone else's fast food, and the particular mustiness of a car that had sat in an impound lot through 2 seasons of rain. He adjusted the mirror. He checked the dash cam angle. He folded his hands in his lap and looked straight ahead through the cracked windshield at the empty parking garage beyond. He had spent 14 months building this case from 41 pieces of broken testimony. He had one night to close it. He drove into the corrupt precinct knowing exactly what they did in the dark. Now he just needed them to do it on camera. Sterling did not wait. That was the first thing. That was the thing Marcus noted with the calm cataloging precision of a man who had spent 14 months reading complaints, because every single one of the 41 statements described the same pattern, the same choreography, the same sequence of escalation designed to destabilize and intimidate before a single word had been exchanged. Sterling did not wait for Marcus to produce the license. He did not wait for the registration. He planted one hand on the roof of the sedan, leaned down into the open window, and let his eyes move slowly across the interior of the car with the unhurried, proprietary ease of a man inspecting something he already owned. "You people," Sterling said, "are all the same." He said it quietly, almost conversationally. The way a man says something he has said so many times, it has stopped feeling like a statement and started feeling like a fact. Marcus kept his hands on the wheel. He kept his face still. He kept his breathing even slow, measured in through the nose, out through the mouth, the same technique he used in federal depositions when opposing counsel said something designed to provoke, because the provocation was the point. The reaction was the evidence, and Marcus Hayes did not give away evidence. "License," Sterling said. "Now." Marcus reached for the glove compartment again, the same slow, open, deliberate movement as before. He produced his license and held it out through the window. Sterling took it without looking at it. He held it loosely between two fingers at his side, not reading it, not running it, just holding it the way a man holds something he intends to use as leverage rather than information. Marcus watched this. He noted it. He filed it. Step out of the vehicle. Marcus did not move immediately, not from hesitation, not from fear. He paused, because the instruction had no legal basis, and he wanted the dash cam to record the pause, to record the absence of resistance, to record the clean, unambiguous sequence of a lawful citizen being given an unlawful order. Then he opened the door and stepped out into the cold. The air hit him hard, wet sharp, dragging its teeth across every exposed surface of skin. His sneakers touched the pavement and found it slick, rain-slicked and glistening under the cruiser's spotlight, reflecting the white glare back up in fragmented, shifting pieces. He stood beside the car, both hands visible at his sides, and looked at Sterling with the same flat, unreadable expression he had been wearing since the lights first hit his mirrors. Sterling looked him up and down. The smirk widened. "You got anything in the car I should know about?" "No, sir," Marcus said. "That right." Sterling moved past him to the passenger door. Not a question, not a request. He pulled the door open without asking, without stating a reason, without any gesture toward the legal framework that governed what he was doing, because Sterling did not operate within that framework, and everyone on the streets of this precinct knew it, and no one had ever made him answer for it. Until now. He reached inside. He pulled out the cheap canvas gym bag from the back seat and held it at arm's length, then dropped it. It hit the wet asphalt with a heavy, sickening slap canvas and damp paper meeting frozen pavement, and the sound of it carried in the cold air with a clarity that made two lights come on in the houses across the street. Marcus did not look at the bag. He looked at Sterling. He watched Sterling's hands, his posture, his movements, because every movement was data, and data was what had brought Marcus here in the first place. Sterling unzipped the bag where it sat on the ground. He crouched over it and pulled out the contents one by one, dropping each item onto the wet street with a carelessness that was not accidental, that was not casual, that was precisely calibrated to communicate a single message to the man standing 3 feet away. A notebook, its cover immediately darkening with absorbed water. A folded rain jacket shoved into a puddle forming at the edge of the gutter, a phone charger, a pen, a granola bar still in its wrapper, each item placed on the wet ground with the deliberate, contemptuous indifference of a man who had done this before and had never once been required to pick anything up or apologize for any of it. "Wallet," Sterling said, standing. Marcus reached into his back pocket and produced it. Sterling took it, opened it, and went through it slowly, pulling out cards and receipts and holding them up to the spotlight, examining each one with theatrical suspicion. His fingers left smudges on the edges of the cards. He dropped 2 receipts. He did not pick them up. Marcus watched the receipts fall. He watched the ink begin to bleed in the rainwater. He kept his face still and his hands visible and his breathing even, because there was a version of this moment where a man lost his composure and gave Sterling exactly what Sterling needed to escalate, to fabricate, to transform a constitutional violation into a legitimate arrest. And Marcus was not going to be that version of this moment. He was not going to give Sterling anything. "This, your documentation." Sterling had found the plastic sleeve. He pulled it from the interior of the glove compartment, turned it over once in his hands, and looked at Marcus with an expression that said the question was not a real question. "This is my documentation, sir," Marcus said, clearly, carefully, each word placed with the deliberate weight of a man who knew that every syllable was being recorded. "Please handle it carefully." Sterling looked at the sleeve. He looked at Marcus. He looked back at the sleeve. Then he tucked it under his arm and turned back to the car. Sterling thought he was establishing dominance. Instead, he was methodically building a federal indictment against himself, one discarded receipt, one dropped notebook, one unlawful search at a time.
Wait. Absolutely not. He just tossed a man's personal belongings onto the wet street without a warrant. If that were me, I would have lost my temper the second he opened that door. Imagine standing in the freezing cold while someone violates your constitutional rights just because they can. The audacity is real.
The first light came on at 4:17 in the morning. A single window, second floor, third house from the corner. The curtain pulling back just enough to frame a face, just enough to show the shape of someone who had been woken by the siren and had come to the window. The way people in this neighborhood came to windows when they heard sirens, not with curiosity, but with dread. Marcus saw it in his peripheral vision. He did not turn his head. He kept his eyes on Sterling, kept his hands at his sides, kept his breathing at its steady practice pace, but he saw the face in the window and he knew what it meant, and the knowing settled into his chest like something cold and familiar. Then the second light came on. Then the third. They did not come on all at once. They came on one at a time, slowly, reluctantly, the way lights come on when people are waking themselves to something they would rather sleep through. A ground floor window across the street. A porch light 2 houses down triggered by a motion sensor or by a hand reaching for a switch in the dark. A light in a side doorway where a woman in a heavy coat stood with her arms folded and her face set in the expression of someone who had seen this before and had never been able to do a single thing about it. Sterling noticed them. Of course he noticed them. Marcus watched the shift happen in real time, watched the moment Sterling registered the audience and made the calculation. And the calculation was not the one a man makes when he wants to de-escalate or withdraw or conduct himself with any shadow of professional restraint. It was the other calculation, the one that said, an audience was not a deterrent but an opportunity, a chance to demonstrate, to perform, to reinforce the lesson this neighborhood had been learning for years. Sterling's voice went up. Not much. Just enough to carry. I said, put your hands where I can see them. He said, even though Marcus's hands were already visible, had been visible since the moment he stepped out of the car, were hanging open and still at his sides in the cold air, with absolutely nothing to hide and nothing to threaten and nothing to offer except their own quiet, irrefutable compliance. But Sterling said it anyway, loudly, clearly, for the benefit of the people on their porches and in their windows, because the words were not for Marcus. The words were for them. The words were a reminder, a demonstration, a message delivered in the language of power to the people who had to live inside it every single day. Marcus put his hands up slightly, higher than necessary, palms forward, fingers spread, the universal posture of total non-resistance, exaggerated just enough to make the point visible to anyone watching, because Marcus understood audiences too, and he understood them differently than Sterling did. The woman in the side doorway did not move. She stood with her arms folded and watched with the particular stillness of someone who has trained herself not to react, not to call out, not to give any visible signal that could be used as a reason to redirect the encounter in her direction. She was older. She had gray at her temples and a coat that had seen many winters, and eyes that had seen more than any coat. She watched Marcus standing on the wet asphalt in the spotlight, and her face did not change, and that unchanging face told Marcus everything he needed to know about how many times she had stood in that doorway and watched something exactly like this, and had never seen it end any differently. A man appeared on the porch of the corner house. Young. Thin jacket for the weather, too thin. The kind of jacket that said he had come out quickly without thinking about the cold, because the cold was not the thing on his mind. He stood with one hand on the porch railing and watched. He did not take out a phone. He did not call out. He simply stood and watched with the careful, contained stillness of someone who knew that visible solidarity could be reframed as interference, that interference could become a reason, and reasons were things Sterling's precinct manufactured with terrible efficiency. The heavy, suffocating silence of the frightened neighbors pressed down on the street, broken only by the crackle of Sterling's police radio, a burst of static, and a dispatcher's voice cutting through the cold air and then going quiet again. The silence that followed was deeper than the one before it. It had texture. It had history. It was the silence of a community that had learned over years, over dozens of encounters exactly like this one, that speaking cost more than staying quiet. That watching was the only form of witness that did not put you at risk of becoming the next person standing in the spotlight. Marcus knew this silence. He had read it in 41 statements. He had heard it in the spaces between sentences, in the careful, qualified language of people describing what they saw without naming what they felt, because what they felt was not something the formal record had room for. He had felt the weight of it through the pages, and now he was standing inside it in the cold and the wet and the white glare of Sterling's spotlight, and the weight of it was exactly as heavy as the 41 statements had told him it would be. He subtly shifted his stance. A small adjustment, barely perceptible, the kind of movement that looked like nothing more than a man redistributing his weight against the cold. But the angle of his shoulders changed. His chest turned 3 degrees to the left. Sterling's position, Sterling's hands, Sterling's badge catching the amber glow of the street lamp, all of it slid into perfect alignment with the dash cam's field of view centered clean, unobstructed, recording everything. The neighbors watched in silence, too afraid to speak. But Marcus was recording everything, and his memory was flawless. If you want to see how this corrupt cop accidentally signs his own federal arrest warrant, you know what to do. Now back to Marcus. Sterling had been enjoying himself. That was the worst part. Not the cold, not the spotlight, not the wet asphalt soaking through the thin canvas of Marcus's sneakers, but the enjoyment. The visible, unguarded, almost childlike pleasure Sterling took in the performance of his own authority, the way his shoulders had loosened over the past 20 minutes, the way the smirk had settled into something more permanent, more comfortable, the expression of a man who had arrived at a familiar place and found everything exactly as he had left it. He had an audience. He had a compliant subject. He had a rusted car and a man in a cheap sweatshirt and a plastic sleeve that he had been turning over in one hand for the past 30 seconds with the casual disinterest of someone handling junk mail. He had not read it. Marcus had watched him not read it. Sterling had looked at the outside of the sleeve, had registered that there was a folded document inside, and had made the calculation that the document did not matter, that nothing inside that cheap plastic sleeve could possibly matter, because the man standing in the spotlight in worn sneakers and a faded sweatshirt was not the kind of man who carried documents that mattered. This was the assumption Marcus had built the entire night around. This was the load-bearing wall of the trap, the single point of arrogance that held everything else up, and Sterling was pressing against it now with both hands without knowing it existed. Sterling pulled the document out of the sleeve. He unfolded it once. He looked at the top line. His eyes moved across it without stopping, without slowing, without the small involuntary pause that a man makes when he reads something that registers as significant. He had decided before he opened it that it was not significant, and so he did not read it, and so it was not. He refolded it loosely, not along the original creases, but carelessly, imprecisely, the way a man folds something he is about to throw away. "This," Sterling said, holding it up between 2 fingers, "means nothing." "Sir," Marcus said, "that document requires your attention." Sterling looked at him. The smirk sharpened. "My attention." He said it the way a man repeats a phrase to show how little it means to him. He looked at the document again, then with no hesitation, no ceremony, no moment of doubt, he tore it in half. The sound was small. Paper tearing is always a small sound, but it carried in the cold air with a clarity that seemed disproportionate to its size, sharp and clean and final, the sound of something being unmade. Marcus watched the 2 halves separate. He kept his face still. He kept his hands at his sides. He kept his breathing even slow, in and out, in and out. But somewhere behind the stillness, something pulled tight, something that was not fear and was not anger, but was the specific, terrible grief of a man who knows exactly how many people have stood in this exact position on a street exactly like this one, Without a hidden badge, without a dash cam, without 3 hours of federal preparation and 14 months of case building behind them. Just a person. Just a cold street. Just a man with a badge and a smirk, and the absolute unquestioned certainty that no one was coming. Sterling tore it again. Quarters now. He held the 4 pieces up briefly, almost playfully, then opened his fingers and let them fall. The white fragments caught the spotlight on the way down. They turned and drifted in the cold air, small and bright and weightless, and then the wind took them, scattering them across the wet asphalt, dropping them into the shallow puddles that had formed along the gutter, pressing them flat against the dark ground next to Marcus's soaked sneakers. The ink began to blur immediately. The federal seal, the judge's signature, the case number, the precise legal language of a signed federal subpoena, all of it dissolving slowly into the dirty water at the edge of the road. Sterling unclipped his handcuffs. The metallic clink was sharp, heavy, deliberate. It was not the sound of a tool being retrieved. It was the sound of a period being placed at the end of a sentence, the sound of a man announcing that the performance was over and the consequence was beginning. Sterling held the cuffs loosely in one hand and looked at Marcus with an expression that had moved past the smirk into something flatter, something more final, the expression of a man closing a door. "Resisting arrest, Sterling said. "You've been uncooperative since I approached the vehicle." Marcus stood very still. The cold pressed in from every direction, finding the gaps in the sweatshirt settling against the back of his neck, pooling in the wet canvas of his shoes. The neighbors on their porches had not moved. The woman in the side doorway had not moved. The young man with the thin jacket had not moved. They were watching a thing they had watched before and had never been able to stop, and their stillness was not indifference. It was the accumulated weight of every previous time they had watched and stayed quiet and gone back inside and carried the memory of it forward into the next day and the next and the next, without any resolution, without any justice, without any morning that felt different from the one before. This was what the 41 statements had tried to describe. This specific moment, this specific feeling, the moment when the law, the thing that was supposed to exist between the person and the harm, simply stepped aside. When the uniform became the threat and the badge became the weapon and the street became a place where the ordinary protections that ordinary people were promised simply did not apply. Marcus had read about this moment 30, 40 times. He had read it in careful language and in shaking handwriting, and in the flat, exhausted prose of people who had stopped expecting to be believed. He was standing inside it now, and it was exactly as described, and the description had not been adequate because no description was ever adequate for the feeling of standing alone in the cold, while someone with the full weight of institutional authority prepared to do something wrong and smiled while they prepared. The red light on the dash cam blinked 3 times in rapid succession. Fast, urgent, rhythmic. 3 blinks. The signal. The federal panic button, triggered automatically by the detection of the handcuff audio signature on the uplink, was now broadcasting Marcus's GPS coordinates to a secure federal response channel. Sterling saw none of this. Sterling was looking at Marcus and thinking about the resisting arrest report he was going to file in the morning. Sterling smiled, thinking he had erased the man's only defense, but he had just committed the exact felony Marcus needed. Sterling reached for Marcus's wrist. He moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done this hundreds of times, the same reach, the same grip, the same forward pressure designed to turn a person and bring their hands behind their back in one continuous, well-rehearsed motion. His fingers closed around Marcus's left wrist. Cold metal touched skin, and then the sound came. It started low, a deep, resonant rumble at the far end of the street. The kind of sound that does not announce itself immediately but builds, grows, fills the space between the houses with a vibration that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. Marcus heard it. Sterling heard it too. Sterling's grip tightened for 1 second, instinctive, territorial, the reflex of a man who does not like interruptions. Then the lights appeared at the end of the block. Not 1 set, 3. 3 pairs of headlights, wide set high. mounted the kind of lights that belong to large vehicles moving with purpose and intention, sweeping the street from curb to curb as they turned the corner in tight coordinated formation. Behind the headlights came the vehicles themselves, 3 black SUVs unmarked moving fast, their engines producing the low authoritative growl of something that had not come this far to stop short of its destination. They filled the narrow street completely. Their tactical lights came on as they closed the distance, white and blinding and absolute, and the combined force of those lights swallowed Sterling's single patrol spotlight the way the sun swallows a candle. Sterling released Marcus's wrist. He took 1 step back. His hand moved toward his radio. "Back up," he said mostly to himself, with the satisfied confidence of a man whose reinforcements had arrived on schedule. He straightened his posture. He reset the smirk. He turned toward the approaching vehicles with his badge hand ready, prepared to receive the acknowledgement of colleagues who would see immediately what he had: a compliant subject, a controlled scene, a stop well in hand. He was already composing the version of events he would deliver. He was already certain of how this next part went. The 3 SUVs stopped in a tight arc around the patrol car. Their doors opened simultaneously. 4 agents from each vehicle, 12 federal agents total, moving with the quiet, synchronized precision of people who had rehearsed this deployment and knew exactly where they were going and why. They did not look at Sterling. They did not move toward Marcus. They spread across the street in a practiced pattern, 2 agents positioning at the rear of the patrol car, 2 at the front, the others fanning outward to secure the perimeter, their movements efficient, economical, entirely indifferent to Sterling's presence. Sterling's smirk held for approximately 4 more seconds. Then it began to fail. "Hey," he said. He took a step toward the nearest agent. "Hey, this is my stop. I've got a subject here. I need you to hold the perimeter and let me finish the..." The agent did not look at him. The agent moved past him with the calm, purposeful indifference of someone navigating around a piece of furniture. Sterling stopped. He turned. He looked at the scene around him, at 12 federal agents arranging themselves on the street, with no reference to him, no deference to him, no acknowledgement of his authority or his presence, or the patrol car still idling at the curb, and something shifted behind his eyes. Not understanding yet, not comprehension, just the first tremor of a certainty beginning to crack. The lead agent, tall, composed, her credentials clipped to the front of a dark tactical vest, walked directly to Marcus. She stopped 2 feet in front of him. She looked at him, and something in her posture changed, not dramatically, not with ceremony, but with the small definitive shift of a person who has found who they were looking for. She saluted. Clean, sharp, formal. The salute of a federal agent acknowledging a superior officer in the field. It lasted 2 seconds. It was witnessed by 12 agents, by Sterling, by every frightened face on every porch on the street. In the window of the corner house, a curtain moved. Sterling made a sound, not a word. Just a sound, the involuntary vocalization of a man whose internal model of a situation has just been proven catastrophically wrong. He looked at the lead agent. He looked at Marcus. He looked at the lead agent again. His hand was still near his radio, but no longer reaching for it, suspended in the cold air in a posture that had intended to communicate one thing and now communicated nothing at all. Marcus reached up to the collar of the faded sweatshirt. He gripped the zipper. He pulled it down slowly, not with drama, not with theater, but with the same quiet, deliberate patience he had applied to every other movement of the night. The zipper reached the bottom. He shrugged the sweatshirt open. Beneath it, pressed flat against a simple dark shirt, the interior pocket lay exactly where he had placed it 3 hours ago, in the evidence room of the DOJ building, in the clean fluorescent silence of an office where 41 complaints had been spread across a desk, and read every word, every line, every shaking sentence. He reached into the pocket. He produced the badge. It caught the tactical lights of the 3 SUVs and threw them back with the full, unbothered authority of solid gold and federal seal. It was not a small object. It was not an apologetic object. It sat in Marcus's palm, heavy, gleaming pristine, entirely unaffected by everything that had happened on this street in the past 40 minutes because it had been waiting patiently in that pocket through all of it, through the spotlight and the illegal search, through the scattered belongings and the torn paper and the handcuffs and the smirk, waiting for exactly this moment. Sterling stared at it. The color left his face in stages, like water draining, like a light being slowly turned down. His mouth opened. Nothing came out. He looked at the badge and then at Marcus's face, and then at the 12 agents arranged around him on the street, and the full architecture of the night began to assemble itself in his expression piece by piece, each piece worse than the last. He expected the man in the sweatshirt to beg for mercy. He never expected to be staring down the director of the Department of Justice. Marcus let the silence hold. He did not rush it. He did not fill it with words or explanation or the kind of declaratory speech that the moment might have invited, because Marcus Hayes had never been interested in speeches. He had been interested in evidence and records, in the slow, patient accumulation of documented truth. And the truth was already assembled, already recorded, already uploaded to a federal server where it would remain permanently, unimpeachably beyond the reach of anyone who might want it to disappear. The speech was unnecessary. The badge in his palm said everything that needed to be said, and Sterling's face confirmed that every word had been received. Sterling had not moved. He stood in the same position he had occupied when the badge appeared. His hand still near his radio, his mouth still slightly open, his face still cycling through the stages of a comprehension that kept arriving in new, worse layers. The handcuffs were still in his other hand. He had not reclipped them. He seemed to have forgotten they were there. Forgotten that he was holding them, forgotten everything except the object in Marcus's palm and the 12 federal agents arranged around him on the street like a geometry lesson in consequences. Marcus closed his hand around the badge. He looked at Sterling with the same flat, patient expression he had worn since the spotlight first hit his mirrors, the expression that Sterling had read as submission, and that had been from the first second the opposite of submission. It had been control. Total practiced, deliberate control, the expression of a man who knew exactly where every step of this night was going and had simply needed Sterling to take each one. "Officer Sterling," Marcus said. His voice was level quiet, entirely without heat. "My name is Marcus Hayes. I am the director of the Civil Rights Division of the Department of Justice. The document you destroyed approximately 19 minutes ago was an active federal subpoena bearing the seal of a United States District Court judge. It was a lawful federal instrument. Its destruction constitutes felony evidence tampering under Title 18, Section 1519 of the United States Code." Sterling's mouth closed. It opened again. Nothing. "In addition," Marcus continued, "your conduct during this stop has been recorded in its entirety by a federally certified dashcam transmitting on a secure satellite uplink. The recording includes an unlawful vehicle search conducted without reasonable suspicion or warrant, the deliberate destruction of a federal legal instrument, a false statement of resisting arrest against a compliant subject, and the use of a threatened arrest to obstruct the execution of a federal subpoena, all of it, from the moment you pulled out of the parking lot on Renner Avenue." Sterling took one step backward. His heel caught the edge of the wet asphalt, and he steadied himself. And the small, graceless stumble was the most honest thing he had done all night. The lead agent moved. She crossed the distance between them in 4 steps, quiet and deliberate, and stopped directly behind Sterling. She looked at Marcus, once received a small, precise nod, and turned back to Sterling with the calm, unhurried efficiency of someone completing a task they have prepared for carefully. She took the handcuffs from Sterling's unresisting hand. She guided his wrists behind his back. The cold, unforgiving steel of federal handcuffs locked tightly, one after the other, over Sterling's crisp uniform sleeves, over the polished edges of the cuffs that had been pressed and starched and presented to the world every shift as the visible evidence of institutional authority. The click of the second cuff was very small, very clean, very final. The absolute devastating silence that followed fell over Sterling completely. Not the silence of the street, not the held-breath silence of the neighbors on their porches, but the specific interior silence of a man watching the entire architecture of his certainty collapse at once. The color that had been draining from his face since the badge appeared finished draining now. What remained was pale stun, the face of a man who had built his entire professional life on the assumption that the spotlight only ever pointed in one direction, and had just discovered in the worst possible way that this was not a law of nature, but a condition that could be revoked. On the porches, no one moved for 1 full second. Then the woman in the side doorway unfolded her arms. She placed both hands on the door frame and she let out a breath that was not quite a sound and not quite a word, but carried every year of standing in that doorway and watching and saying nothing and going back inside. The young man on the corner porch lifted his hand from the railing and pressed it flat against his chest. The curtain in the second-floor window pulled all the way back. Someone started clapping, then someone else. Then the street filled with it. Ragged, scattered, genuine, the sound of people who had not expected this morning to be different from any other morning and were finding, with an astonishment that was almost too large to hold, that it was. Sterling was guided to the rear door of the nearest federal SUV. He did not resist. He did not speak. He folded into the back seat with the mechanical compliance of a man whose will had been entirely replaced by the simple requirement of following instructions, and the door closed behind him. And the lock engaged and the polished silver badge on his chest caught the tactical lights one final time through the window glass before the vehicle began to move. Marcus watched it go. 2 agents remained to process the scene, documenting the position of the patrol car, bagging the torn fragments of the subpoena from the mud and the gutter for the evidence record. A 3rd agent approached the sedan and removed the dash cam with careful gloved hands, confirming the uplink connection and initiating the formal evidence transfer protocol. She looked up at Marcus when it was done. "Full recording confirmed, sir," she said. "Clean chain of custody from activation." Marcus nodded once. He walked to the edge of the gutter. He crouched down. The torn pieces of the subpoena were dark with water, soft, barely holding their shape, the federal seal blurred to a ghost of itself. He gathered each fragment carefully, patiently, the way he had gathered 41 complaints from 41 people who had stood on streets exactly like this one. He pressed them together in his palm, wet and cold and torn, but present. Still present. He stood. He walked back to the rusted sedan. He got in, closed the door, and placed the torn pieces on the passenger seat beside him. The engine turned over on the second try. He pulled away from the curb, drove slowly past the porches where people were still standing, still watching, still holding the unfamiliar and fragile weight of a morning that had ended differently. He did not accelerate. He did not look back. Marcus picked up the torn pieces of paper from the mud, got back into the rusted sedan, and drove away into the morning light.
Trap itself in its own arrogance is a feeling like no other. If you were in Marcus's shoes, standing on that wet asphalt, how long could you have stayed silent while your rights were violated? Tell me what you would have done in the comments below. I read every single one. Subscribe to the channel because systemic justice never gets old, and our next story will leave you completely speechless.